Hello, everyone trickling in. Welcome to Prevalence webinar series here. And I'm going to hit you all with a poll question while I start doing these introductions. And we like to call this While You're Waiting. We're curious, what prompted you to join this webinar today? Education, project research, you have an upcoming project. Oh, that was a hot, immediate yes, so that's exciting. You don't know where you are. Where are you? I'll tell you, you'll learn something. And you're a prevalent customer, which is always nice to continue on your education with what you are using, right? So I'm going to keep that up for a hot second and let me know. You guys can see my screen, right? Yes?
So far, it says how recent regulatory changes impact third-party risk management programs.
Wow, that's really exciting. Thanks for reading that, Yafi. Yeah, that's what we're talking about today. So that is the topic, and we have two great speakers here. It's going to be like a Q&A for everybody, so pay attention. And I'm going to change the screen over here. Here we go. Here are your speakers. We have the one and only Mike Yaffe here, our very own CMO at Prevalent, who will be asking questions to Alpa Inamdar, who is the transformation leader at AIG. And for the last 10 years, she's heavily focused on third-party risk management. And as a disclaimer for everybody, just want you to know that this is Alpa's own perspective. It's nothing attached to AIG, so just be very aware on this. And a couple of housekeepings while we get started. You guys, you're all muted, but please use the Q&A to ask as many questions as you like. We'll use them towards the end of the session. We have the chat as well. This is all being recorded, so even if you're not exactly paying attention, or maybe you have to hop off or you want to share it, it'll be in your inbox later today. I will personally be sending it to you. And I'm Amanda, and I am in business development here at Prevalent. So I have one more poll question that we're curious about in order to get this one started here. And we are going to launch it right now. And we have another curiosity. We want to know what percentage of your organization's time is currently spent on third-party risk management. It's a single choice question, and it's a range, obviously, as you can see. Already, a lot is 0 to 33%, you guys, just as an FYI. I'm going to give it 20 more seconds. You guys are very active. So thanks, everyone, for paying attention here and using this. And I'm going to end it now. It looks like heavily, I'm going to share the results, heavily 0 to 33%. So that's why you guys are here.
For those 3 people that answered 60 to 100% of the time, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm going to kick it over to you, Yaffe. Thanks.
That is great. Everyone. So a couple things. One, I need to get rid of this gray. And I said this on the where, but that's, you can see all the grays coming in. So the picture is a little old. And 2, I live in Boston, but I did get a chance to meet somebody from the Dodgers a while ago. So big Red Sox fan. I was at the game last night. And I'm basically talking about 2 teams that are probably going to get blown out next game. So we're looking at Houston and Atlanta, right? So, so thank you for being here, everybody. Look, we have about 10 questions, 15 questions we're going to try to get through. I can handle checking the QA. So if something comes up, but we're going to try to, rapid fire, get through these, ask a bunch of questions. If there's something you have to know, send it in via the chat function, and I'll try to get to it. If not, we'll get to it at the end. But Alpa, let's first, thanks for being here. Let's just jump right into it. So what are you seeing in third party? You've been doing this for over a decade, right? Talk about where you're seeing any changes, any movement in the industry. And those are going to be 3 discussion topics relative to this question.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you so much. Really excited to be back to do this session. And look, I think the question you're asking is extremely critical, right? What are the trends? And before I really start going deep in some of the trends that I'm noticing, I did want to give a little bit of background. I worked for 20 plus years experience in different industries. So I do have some of my perspective thinking about from manufacturing, aero defense, financial, and insurance. So you'll get a more 360 on some of these. And Mike, you can of course clarify some of them are purely related to financial industry as well. So some of the trends we're seeing currently is, as probably one of the hottest topic is our cyber attacks, right? Cyber attacks are on a rise. We've got cyber attacks on cloud services with about, I think I read an article about 198 million malicious IP detected. As we see what's happening either with SolarWinds, where people are getting extremely, as I call, intelligent in breaking supply chain data management process. So how do we manage the right controls and the right data being on the web? And the other thing you're going to start seeing is the resiliency, right? I think one thing that we learned was, and that was probably one of the biggest trends, if I look at, is how was this trend on operational resiliency? So in the past, what we've seen is a lot of business continuity planning. And when we do these BCP scenarios or the tabletop exercises, they're usually a singular activity, right? So either you have a hurricane, either you had a 9/11. Never have we felt or actually faced a pandemic where it affects every single industry, every single country, and every single human being at a similar time frame. And thus, I think the trend now is, do you have the right resiliency within your organization? And what are you doing about that?
So, and I think that's the fair question. That's the right question. We're talking about supply chain resiliency, vendors. So let's drill into it. So look, most people are struggling. Most of the folks that we work with, right, they're struggling to get all of their tier 1 vendors into some type of repetitive and consistent assessment, either scoring or the actual assessment, right? So when something happens like a SolarWinds, right, you've got people over here that are barely getting to tier 1s, and you're not alone out there. And then over here, you have a potential breach that could affect some unknown amount of your vendors. How do people resolve this gap? What's the recommendation here? What's the course of action?
No, and I mean, it's great because look, most organizations had an extreme challenging time, right? Because exactly like you said, if you think about, especially as I call bigger financial organizations, right? They've been there for a very long time. You have these antiquated legacy infrastructure, and you don't have a good repository of all your vendors in general, right? Because you have some things that are going through your accounts payable directly, but it's not going through a system. Majority of the organizations, not just financials, but even manufacturing, they don't have one system, right? So we don't have a one repository, which makes it that much more challenging, Mike, right? Because you have a legal and contracts in one system. You got some of these vendors that are somewhat deemed to be critical for some businesses in a different system. Then you got an overall arching system that doesn't connect across the organization. And then on top of that, like you said, once you know your tier 1s, in some of these, especially like SolarWinds, they might not be a direct vendor to you, but they might be a 4th or a 5th party to some of the vendors that they provide the critical services to you. So this is where that challenge is, right? Because you don't have one transparency fully on your third party itself, on the vendor, and then to, as I call it's called the spider or spider web or spaghetti, in a sense of you have so many other 4th, 5th, and parties that the vendors have. You don't have the transparency in order to be extremely proactive when something like SolarWinds or the national pipeline or the AXA breaches happen, because by the time you actually go through all the data, it is, sometimes you're not even getting to the data. And we're literally calling our vendors up in a manual process and saying, hey, we've seen this in SolarWinds. Are these your 4th parties or your 5th parties? And they're like, I'm not sure, but here's some of the vendors that we deal with. And then you kind of take that next step and call them up and try to find out.
So what's the so clearly articulated the problem, but so what's the remediation? Is it you have to be identifying your vendors at all times? Is it you have to put a structured plan? I mean,
I think there's a bunch of things, right? You have to put a structured plan. You have to know your vendors, but I think you also need to do extra due diligence when you're onboarding these vendors. So now what you're going to start asking is, can I see some soft reports, right? Can I see the SSAE 18? Because that was introduced in 2017. So I think now you got to look at the annual reviews and make sure that, your assessments aren't just done on annual basis, where you're frequently talking to your critical vendors and getting this due diligence and the right information. So like what you just said, Mike, is how do we then address once you have the
Because it's
data?
always after the horse has left the barn. I think the one thing that you said for me here is, look, on onboarding, it takes no effort not no effort, but right. It makes a lot of sense to just say, look, I need a list of all your major operating platforms. I need a list of all of these things so it's it's easily correlated. If something happens, you can at least go to your vendors or that. I like that. As you can tell, we hadn't discussed this previously. That is an answer. So that actually makes a lot of sense.
Right. But it's hard too, right? Because think about it, and again, bigger size organization, Fortune 500, you're talking about anywhere between 3 to 10,000 vendors, Mike. So
well, that's
keeping that
right?
data.
I mean, we talk to people who are like, I have 30 tier vendors, and you talk to people like, and I can say this publicly because they've done stuff. We have Lowe's and Pfizer and a few others, thousands and thousands and thousands of vendors. So, they might be trying to do 30 vendors a day where that's somebody's universe. So it's
exactly.
Very good.
But I think you have to, because we did the on-site assessments, you did your due diligence, you use your SIG as a questionnaire, but you have to do additional, right? And COVID has kind of highlighted that more than anything, saying, it's not good enough to just go and ask these, as I call, due diligence questionnaires once a year, and thinking that those organizations are still actually, in the market.
Yep. So ESG. So a lot of people are talking about ESG. We talk to Gartner regularly, and everybody wants to be, socially responsible in doing it. I think at some point people will get to doing it, and maybe it's just us, but I'm not seeing a ton of people doing it. I'm seeing a lot of people thinking about doing it. Like, where are you at? Where do you see this right now?
Yeah, no, I think ESG has become, like you said, I think it's become critical. I think after Larry Fink's, letter to the CEO, right, with the net carbon footprint by 2050,
Sure.
in every organization, like you said, either it's, biotech, if it's air defense, automotive, financial, everybody's talking about ESG. But what is the actual tangible action? I do think ESG becomes somewhat easier when you're in manufacturing, right? Because you can look at your green plants, you can look at the carbon footprint, you can look at your production lines. It gets a little bit, as I call, challenging as we move to the financial industry. And the reason why is because everybody keeps saying I'm environmentally focused, but what does that mean, right? What are you measuring? And how are you measuring that? So, we're going to be emission free by X, but what are the how many tons and what is the right criteria? And I don't think, because we don't have specific metrics that we are being evaluated right now, people are just struggling to figure out what is that ESG for that organization. And the second thing is, regulators will get more, and I think you will see a trend eventually that regulations will follow the ESG with the specific criteria and metrics, where I think organizations then can say, I am ESG focused. But right now, I think there's much more conversations we are moving towards, because I think the leadership and the board does want to make sure that they comply with the ESG policies. But I think we'll see more coming up in next 2-3 years, to be honest.
Fair enough. And I agree. I think it's important. It's coming. It's probably, but you got to get your kind of house in order. Amanda, can you flip over to the next question? So, look, you've already alluded to this and talked about the massive supply chain disruptions with COVID, but, I feel like we're failing to learn the lessons of the past. You're like, I'll never do this again. And, it's like when you say you drink too much in college, you're like, I'll never drink this much again. And then, 2 weeks later, you're like, I did it again. So, have we learned the lessons? Have people diversified their supply chains? Are they truly engaging with their vendors, their third parties, their fourth parties? I mean, how far would you say that COVID has pushed in a positive way? Have we regressed at all? Just where do you see?
I think
post-COVID, even though we're not, but where do you see it?
Right, exactly. No, but you're right. I think we as human, we have a tendency, right? We kind of forget very easily. And especially if it's a painful process, we forget that a little bit faster. So how do we change that process? And I think what has happened with COVID and why I think these lessons are learned and will retain, because we all at some point felt the pain. And what do I mean by that? Because it affected all industries, right? We all at some point either went to a grocery store and there was not enough either, paper towels or Purells or sanitizers or even meat for that matter, right? Anything, it was across the board. And people knew how critical supply chain disruption affects their day-to-day life. It also affects the reputation of the organization, right? So if you hypothetically go today to a store and they don't have a specific product, nobody's going on that product. They are branding the store, saying they are not doing their due diligence and they're taking the accountability. And I think that's what's happening in the organization, right? Because the reputation is so high, they have to make sure that they invest properly. And I think what they've learned is after COVID, right, they didn't have a good control. So now, how do we make sure that one, we have a good repository of our vendors? How do we make sure that we are constantly in line with these vendors in a sense of the services they perform? Are they really critical? Because in the past, we've had records where you had critical vendors that didn't change for, decades.
Right.
Now, after COVID, that critical vendor to be honest, might not be the one I'm worried about because they're Fortune 100 or Fortune 500. So for example, Microsoft wasn't going to go anywhere. Yes, COVID, it affected them, but you might have had to shift your power to these smaller companies.
To me, the question is, and do you see organizations, and I guess organizations, by that I mean board executives, do you see people saying, hey, look, we have to baseline our vendors here. There's too many risks to our business. Is it being taken more seriously at the board by the executives? Because look, in some cases, the folks that I already mentioned, they take this super seriously. In other cases, they're like, it's 15th on a line of, and I've been in InfoSec for 20 years. I mean, that's always the case, right? You're like, take a number. It's like the deli counter, I joke, right? Take a number of the deli counter. I'll call your name and number when you're ready. And sometimes it's number 1, sometimes it's 12. But 30 seconds on that, and I want to get over to the next.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, look, they are now more and more, like you said, the ongoing monitoring is critical. So the leadership is looking at it because the more vendor, the more risk. But at the same time, you also have to look at your concentration risk. So I think there's a balance, right, Mike? It's not.
What do you mean by concentration risk?
So you don't want to only have 4 vendors that, and I'm just making this a hypothesis, but if you only have 4 vendors, you're focusing all your services on, and if 2 of them go down, now you're affecting your whole organization, right? So you are putting all your eggs in one basket, as I would call it. And so you have to be careful that you don't have too many, but you can't have so little that could impact your day-to-day function as an organization. But we do need to look at it because like you said, you have a lot of vendors who are providing a very similar services, and you do need to consolidate them. And
Good point. Next question. So you had said, we were doing the prep, and then you're like, I need to talk about continuous monitoring. It's a game changer. So platform is yours.
Okay, awesome. Well, look, as you said, what are the trends? What are we seeing? Look, we have to move away from this manual questionnaire.
Question. Before, define what you mean by continuous monitoring, because there's, look, in third-party risk, there's kind of that continuous scoring, there's business risks, and then there's assessment. So like, I assume nothing. So define it, and then tell people why it's
sure. So look, so what I'll define it this way. Continuous monitoring is when we originally started looking at third-party governance, right? We would usually look at one single point of time, right? So you look at a vendor in January, and then you look at them based on criticality, March, April, whatever next year. Now the approach, when you say continuous monitoring, is pretty much what you're looking at is every single vendor, critical vendors you have, you're monitoring on a daily basis with real-time alerts. So it is not looking at one point of time. It's not going through a questionnaire, but it's going across that vendor and saying, if there's an impact, either from an IP address that they have an issue, either there's a service disruption, either there's a hurricane that's going to affect them, continuous monitoring gives you that real-time alerts based on the specific regions and vendors, and exactly what Mike, you said, is on different risk factors, right? So environmental, operational, compliance, finance. So it looks across all of those. And why this is critical or a game changer is because as more and more data you have, you're not going to be able to allocate thousands and thousands of people to go out on the web and keep searching what are the potential risks. So by being, as I call, technology smart or technology savvy, you will use some of these tools that are out in the industry where they're going to do continuous monitoring, where they give you these alerts, and then you proactively can take an action based on those alerts. Again,
it's funny. I remember so I started in vulnerability and penetration testing and security 100 years ago, and all this stuff used to be on spreadsheets. And I hear this now, people are like, oh, keep it all on spreadsheets. I'm like, it matured, and this isn't related to prevalent, but guys, getting a platform or help or a managed service or something so you can scale. The whole thing is you don't want to be doing this tactical hunting down of stuff. You need information that you can make effective decisions with, right? And you can't spend, like I said, I'm sorry for those 3 or 4 of you that are spending, 2/3 of I guarantee you're spending all your time sending emails back and forth. So, Alpa, we did have a quick question. It just goes right back to somebody asked you from anonymous attendee. Thank you, anonymous attendee. Vendor concentration. They were talking about, how about cloud with the top 3, AWS, Google, and MS Azure. So does that, they were asking about it, but does that create a disproportionate dependency in your mind?
It does. It significantly does, right? But again, because we talked about scale, right? All 3 of them have scale, and thus we have a heavy reliance on all organization on those 3, and that is going to impact at some point. And this is where, like you said, if you think about your weakest link, this could, but at the same time, do you want to take a risk going to a smaller organization where you don't have transparency, where they're storing your sensitive, confidential data in a cloud? So we rely on the top 3 right now, but that's a great question.
Right on. Let's get to the next one, Amanda. I do want to get into some of the regulatory stuff. So, there's banking laws in England, there's GDPR, we did, and it was, sometimes you'd rather be lucky than good, quite frankly, but we did a NIST webinar with our content expert here, just the updates and changes to NIST. And we usually have like 300 people register. We had like 625 people register. So I'm like, being the marketing guy that I am, I'm like, hey, we should do some more NIST stuff. But it does seem like NIST, PCI, CCPA, a few others are look, I get third party that generally the audit or the legislation or the guidance drives this behavior, but can you talk about which ones you're seeing in the US, which ones you're seeing internationally, why, how come? So feel free to spend a little time on this one. I think the ones, if people like, there's 50 of them, what are the 2 that I need to kind of use as guidance? So would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think there's about 3 of them that I would say are, and 2 globally, 1 US specific. But, the one I'll start with the EBA sourcing and, mainly again on the global front, but and especially in EMEA, to be honest. But this is about all outsourcing arrangement, right? It's including your cloud outsourcing and the question we asked, and the subcontractor and the written register. So how do we make sure we record all your outsourcing engagements? And this is, Mike, if you think about the first question you asked about the 4th parties, because when you're saying subcontractor, that is your 4th and 5th and the end parties. So now, at least within EMEA, they have been starting to really kind of come heavily focus on this EBA sourcing, and most organizations are having a really hard time and they're struggling. And how to solve this issue is now they're going in their process of onboarding and then ongoing monitoring. They're asking these questions to get the data, but we're not getting it fast enough. So I think EBA sourcing is here to stay, and we're going to spend more and more time on it.
Why is it here to stay? Why do you think? I mean, what makes it different, special, unique?
Right, and because you're reliant on other parties, right? Because more and more organizations are either doing managed services or outsourcing. And if you don't have a good control, wherever it's based on locations, the services, the data integrity of it, you will have more risk as an organization. And the regulators don't feel comfortable enough at this level that most companies have a good control of those subcontractors and even the cloud registry.
Fair enough.
And we're going to use cloud, the cloud's not going away, neither is cyber. So, in that element,
I've heard that it's probably here to stay, right?
Yes, exactly.
This cloud thing is going to catch on. I think it's real.
Yeah. And then the other one is, Dora, right, which is stands for Digital Operation Resiliency Act. And this is to really consolidate and upgrade your information communication technology. So it looks.
Where's that one out at? Like, is that where's that one?
That one's mainly from Europe.
Okay.
But it's affecting all globally because I think it's coming here as well. So we have to be kind of watching out. And the reason why this came in is because what they were looking at is risk across all financial entities to ensure that they have a common standard. So if a single cyber incident occurs, it could lead to a systematic risk that threatens the financial stability across the firm, right? So that is the reason why this is spreading. And again, a lot of the regulations you'll see, EMEA is much more ahead and then we get it after. They're also asking a lot of ESG metrics that we haven't seen yet, and that's going to come through. On the US side, modern slavery has been another one. Yeah. We've really started because now that kind of gets affiliated with ESG as well, but it's mainly how do we practice the use of the violence and, the abuse of exploitive people, right? So between human trafficking, child labor, how much, do you have an understanding when you're going to these fourth, fifth parties, especially internationally? But again, US is pure solely responsible in a sense of if you are based out of US, you do need to make sure from a regulation perspective that you have the Modern Slavery Act and you're compliant with it. A little bit harder to do, again, similar, because, are you literally going in every single vendor and saying, are you, there's child labor? It's not as easy to get this kind of information, but I think that's another one we're going to. And then I think, look, ffiec, right? Lots of stuff. It's covering especially financial institutions. So if you think about business continuity planning, now it's gone to the next level where they're saying is show me your plan for your hardware and your cyber attacks. Those were not there 10 years ago. If you think about acquisitions, what is the standard practices when you're acquiring these companies, and do you feel comfortable from a cyber perspective that they have the same mitigants and controls from access, sensitive data, what's going out and in from their systems. Anything on operational risk is another big one that you'll see in ffiec that I think will have a significant impact. So I mean, look, bunch of them, as you will see more and more, either it's OCC bulletin, I think it's 2017. If it's the GDPR, if it's Article 28, all of them are talking about confidential, sensitive data. How are you managing this data, and what controls are you giving back to make sure that the consumer feels comfortable that their data is not being shared and used for other purposes?
Fair enough. We got a quick question, and I think it's a clarification question from Christopher. Christopher, thank you. Looking at regulation, how would you define material and how would you define critical?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I lost you for a second, Mike.
Yeah, no worries. And I'm going to ask back-to-back questions. Another one just popped up. Looking at regulation in general, how would you define material and how would you define critical?
So, look, the critical ones are what is going to impact your business and services, and that you will have a consent order, right? So those are, as I consider, critical. And the regulators, and I'm not sure, but I just want for the audience perspective, when you're looking at regulations from a financial industry perspective, you have three specific regulation impact that can be affected in your organization. You have MRA, which is material risk action. You have MRIA, material risk immediate action, and then you have the consent order. So based on the criticality, there is a significant impact. If you do have a consent order, you will not be able to do your business in the industry. So naturally, and we've seen this across, right, what just Citi has gone through with all the MRIAs, the consent orders they're going through, and Citi's not the only one that we've gone through. A lot of them, either it's JP, HSBC, across the front. So I think that's what it is. The material is, we clearly see if you are not going to focus on within next, and they have a time frame anywhere between 6 months to a year, where these material actions are not resolved, that it could have a significant impact. So criticality, consent orders, materiality is look at these regulations from what kind of repository what you have, what kind of controls you're putting in, and then do you have the right access to make sure that this is materiality.
Somebody quickly wanted to know, they misunderstood the first regulation. Did you say ADA, ABA?
EBA. E is in Emily, B is in boy,
Elvis,
A,
B is
EBA
in
sourcing.
ball, A is in
European
apple.
Banking, I think it's association.
Right on. Amanda, let's bang over somebody thought, one quick question. I thought MRAs, we go to the next question, meant matter requiring attention.
It is matter, sorry, it is matter. I said materialize, I'm sorry, matter, sorry, matter. Good catch.
Thanks for keeping us honest, but again, we're not.
Yeah. And you're all paying attention, which is good
Yeah,
too,
hey,
Mike.
You're paying attention, but we're not going to bust anybody's chops for a slight difference in terms. So
No.
look, you've been doing this longer than most people. What do you see as like just the things you're like, God, if I could just tell everybody in third party, like, do this, don't do this. And let's do the, I see the critical mistakes, and then everybody needs to do this.
So yeah, so I think, look, a couple of things, and in this one I can actually do a whole session, Mike, just because there's so many things I have a list in my
good,
head
Amanda.
that
we'll
goes
schedule
through.
another one, the do's and don'ts.
Right, but let's, so
Perfect.
look, third-party management, risk management is not a checkbox exercise anymore, right? You cannot, what you did a couple of years ago where an organization just said is, hey, you had a small group that just kind of looked at vendors, and we had a list of, did you onboard a client? Check. Do you have a contract? Check. Did you do your on-site assessments? Check. It's more than that, right? You have to understand the impact across all businesses. It's not siloed anymore. It has to be unified. It has to be more strategic. And you have to have the right people, invest in the right talent to make sure that they understand the risk accordingly. So that's the don't and the do, in a sense, of invest in the right people and technology, because we cannot do the Excel spreadsheets. And the other one is
but thank you for saying that. I was just literally, so like, if you're in spreadsheets, are you behind?
You are extremely behind, because you're not going to be able to, and especially now with the speed of changes that are occurring in current environment.
Yeah, I mean, you're not keeping up, I would imagine, with basic baseline program. You're probably not doing all your vendors, let alone, or your tier ones, let alone all of them. So, and I would agree with that. I mean, most of the people, it's funny, most of the folks that we work with fall into two categories. They're still in spreadsheets, and they realize that they're doing it, or they tried to spin something up and failed, and they're like, look, all right, we didn't get it right. We have some money to spend. We're looking look, help us. And the one thing I have to say, and I always say this, is you have to start with the program goal in mind and then work backwards, right? To me, that is the thing. Like, why are we here? What's the outcome? Is it tier ones? Is it identifying? Is it all your vendors? How are you thinking about success? How is your management, your board going to define success? And how are you going to report on that?
Right.
Okay, great. Now let's go to the beginning of the process. And sorry, that's just, we've been doing this forever here. So I see that a lot.
The other one is, I think, look, we cannot rely on this as a single point. I'm a big proponent. You have to know your vendors on a day-to-day basis, especially the critical ones. We cannot sit and saying we did X and, wait for it, because we saw, especially in the last 18 months, how many vendors went under because they didn't have a strong balance sheet or they didn't have the liquidity, right? And you cannot wait for a year or two and have the impact to your businesses and not be able to react. So I think it's being continuously or ongoing monitoring these vendors and have a pulse with them. I think it's going to be extremely critical. The other one is a right governance. So let's say you do find out there's issues with certain vendors. What are you doing with it? Who is getting notified? Because a lot of the times what I see the falling on this third party, why people fail, is we have an issue, but I don't know who to escalate, or I'm escalating it to the wrong people. So, hey, there's a cyber threat or there's a cyber breach. I'm just going to go to IT and let them figure it out. So, hey, IT, information technology, I saw this incident. Are you connecting within your business within your leadership, within compliance, legal, right? The whole 180 or 360 to make sure you have the right stakeholders and do have the right governance, because most organizations, I think, are failing there as well for not having a strong governance and the proper escalation process. And the other one is even you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, look, somebody made a comment about GRC platforms, and I agree. Look, a lot of folks that we work with have Archer or ServiceNow or Coupa, and a lot, look, again, folks, sometimes they choose to go with a best of breed. Sometimes they choose the modules, right? It depends on what they need. I will say, I don't think that those guys, the larger GRCs, were built purposefully for third-party risk. But if, you know, sometimes people just need good enough and they have a module, and that's fine. I'd say, you know, most of the time that people really need to kind of roll up their sleeves, they move towards, and again, I don't necessarily mean us, but something that's more, you know, purpose-built, best of breed provider. But when these systems work in collaboration, you get a lot of data, a lot of useful data for good decision-making.
No, and I agree. And I think, like you said, you know, you've seen, like you said, Savient Labs, Ariba, Archer, there's lots of out there. But I think, again, it's one part, right? The technology is not going to solve your problem in a sense of, it's not investing just in the technology. It's understanding what is your risk appetite? What are your controls, right? Because you can invest, as you know, as I call it, you can spend millions and billions in the system, but if you don't have the right requirements and the scope and what you're trying to get out of that system, you're going to fail, right?
Well, to me, that's it. It's always about, God, I met with this guy who used to be CISO for Providence Healthcare, which was you know, it's a big healthcare out in the Pacific Northwest. And he kind of schooled me on this very early, and risk appetite, right? What's acceptable? What's not? What are you going to accept? What are you going to deny? And what are you going to communicate up? You're like, this is where we're at. Here's our risk. We can choose to fund it, or we have to accept that there's this risk to the business. And then people have to evaluate the potential brand and financial, and sometimes it's quantifiable, sometimes it's not, but that's really important in communicating that as a third. You're like, look, we have major dependencies. We don't know if any of our vendors, going back to the first question, are using SolarWinds. We're not asking any questions that will help us further the conversation here. So, bring up your other point, right? Where you say that this is no longer a tactical checkbox. That's why it's strategic, because it significantly, as we learned from COVID, impacts your supply chain. I just summarized everything you said right there in like 30 seconds. So
I love it. I think you're going to be
all good points, all awesome points. Amanda, let's skip to the next one. Skip this one. We already kind of covered this. This is interesting because most of the people that come to us have generally had a recent audit experience. So as you would imagine, that it's when, you used to work in some of these other companies, hacks or breaches tend to get people's attention. Here it's audit findings. So why do programs fail? What are people looking for in audit? Why are they failing audits? And what are the auditors looking for?
Yeah, look, I mean, auditors are looking at specifically, one is, what is your universe looks like, right? What is that? Do you have a comprehensive list first of your vendors? Then how are you defining them that are critical? Do you have the right definition of defining critical? And I will say, in my, last whatever decade, you have very different answers. Somebody's like, well, because we spend X, Y, Z, they're considered critical. And we're like, okay, so for example, you've got a consultant and they're just doing literally billing. And you're saying because we're spending X amount, they should be somehow critical, right? So I think it's them really assessing what is your definition of critical. Are you looking at like recovery time objective, ITO? Are you looking at what that disruption will have to the overall impact to the business, right? So I think it's defining that list and understanding why it is in that list. Second is, how are you measuring the risk? What kind of processes where you're saying this is highly risky, high risk, low risk, moderate, or nominal, right? And they need to have a very standard and a consistent method of measuring that risk. And that's where you see a lot of audit failings, or, needs more, as called, it's unsatisfactory or needs more work. And the reason why is because what they're saying is you're measuring risk on a different factors across different parts of the firm. And that's where that scale and standardization becomes extremely critical. And then they look at your ongoing monitoring process, right? How are you ongoing monitoring? What are you doing on the due diligence? Are you looking at certain domains? Are you asking for certain additional detailed documentations, right? Are you asking them for their processes, their procedures? What kind of controls do they have? If they fail, what is their backup? And I'll tell you, a lot of the times audit, and this has been, in some of my previous organizations where we've had, what's your exiting strategy plan look like? And to be honest, people think it's very simple. So for example, it's like if I'm using a cellular service Verizon, I'm just going to go to AT&T. But if everybody moves from Verizon to AT&T, do they have the bandwidth to support you? Have you talked about your specific services and can they actually do those in those regions?
And people don't know that detail. Have you ever watched John Oliver on HBO? John Oliver would not support you switching to AT&T.
Okay, great. Well, I'm so sorry, John. That was just an example we leverage, but we'll make I'm not going to any of the proponents. I don't have a specific.
He has two things that he constantly rails. One he rails against, which is AT&T, and then what's his name? Adam Driver, who he loves. Sorry, very much a non sequitur. But back to the.
So maybe T-Mobile. I don't care. Maybe Sprint. I don't know. Whoever the other carriers. But what you're saying is, your exiting strategy has to be accurate, right? If you're really going to think about plan B, have you had this communication with them? Do they know that they would be as a second line of defense? They understand that if there's an issue, they will come and support, and they understand your business model and your strategy. And a lot of the times they don't have that. So I think it's making sure, and then also your procedures, right? Do you have updated procedures? A lot of our procedures had to change because of COVID, right? So if audit comes in and we're saying is everybody's working from home, what are your controls? Have you updated that clause in your policies? And a lot of us have not done that, right? So I think it's that. And then we're in contracts. A lot of my contract says, we hired third, fourth party vendors, but we don't really ask them where they're located and what's the concentration of those vendors. So are they doing 80% of the services? So we need to refine those things, and audit is looking for them. And to be honest, a lot of them, we don't even have contracts. Some of them are evergreen, so we never go back. And some have been outdated and expired. And these are the things that the audit is looking for. And that gives more visibility to regulators as well. How good is your shop?
Right on. Next question, and you know what? We're gonna come up to the 45 minutes. We'll give people time for questions. If not, I always like to end a few minutes early just to give people, a chance. I know we all have a ton of Zoom calls right now. So I love this one in that. So you're running third-party risk program. Let's say you're getting results. What are the metrics you report up to within the security team? What are the executive metrics? What are the board metrics? And maybe they don't go that far, but what are the metrics, which is one. And then the other one, and we've heard this a lot from customers, they're struggling getting other lines of business involved or support or buy-in to kind of working with them to do this. So I think these are the two kind of subjective things that people, once they deployed third-party risk or they've had some kind of process repeatable in place, I think they're struggling with a little bit. So how would you solve both of these things?
Yeah. So look, I think reporting is extremely critical because that's the only transparency you're providing to leadership, right? So the way that we're creating reports is, and again, depending on, so we have weekly and monthly and quarterly reports, but the ones is the severity of that specific finding. So if you have a findings such as access controls or the data privacy, and the vendor is not coming back to you or showing you any, as I call, proof or justification how they manage that, and let's say it's over 15 days or over 30 days, that is now creating a risk for that specific business. So what we do is we have a report saying, hey, we had XYZ findings, here's the severity, high, moderate, low, and what is the timing that we within an organization based on our risk appetite. So if we say 7 days, 15 days, 30 days, and then what is our next action? Do we then terminate the vendor because we're not getting the right information on time, and that's putting us at risk? And those are the reports that we socialize within the leadership. And like you said, now even the board wants these reports because they also want to understand who are these vendors and what could that be impact, and are we okay with terminating these vendors? A lot of them, we use them on the business committee meetings or the new product development committees. That's where we have pretty much all the business leaders in there. And that's where we kind of bring out these findings and walk them through the processes and then saying, and some of them are honestly, as a business, like you said before, they're saying, I'm okay to take this risk because I need this vendor and they will give me this. Otherwise, I will not be able to put my new product in the market. Thus, I'm willing to accept this risk. And some they're saying, nope, we don't feel comfortable with the mitigations that they have provided or the documentations or the reports. So either they'll provide additional or we will not continue to do the business. How do we get business involved? Look, I think more and more business takes accountability, right? Third-party governance, I don't know where they said they could be sitting in operations, they could be sitting in finance, they could sit in compliance. End of the day, it's business who's making the decision and it's business who takes accountability. And one of the way we've started doing this and across, and you'll see it in the industry, especially in the financial, you actually have people embedded in business that look at third-party governance risk for that specific business. And they have like a dotted line. So they have a dotted line to the business and a dotted line to operations or the center of excellence. And I think that's a great way to get business involved, because now the business, one of the excuses, Alpa, I need to focus on the revenue. I don't really care about the risk, and that has to change. And thus having people embedded in the business who has the expertise of the risk can start connecting the dots.
Great. So with that, Amanda, I'm going to come back to you. I think I was looking at the questions. I think we've covered them. So why don't we go back to you? If you have a poll or you got any more questions?
I do. No other questions right now, since you guys took them live, which is awesome. But I do have one more poll question that I'm going to pop in here, and it's similar to the first one, but a bit more specific. And we're just straight to the point since having this conversation with Alpa and Mike. Are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk management program in the coming months? Do you guys have a budget you guys need to create for 2022? Do you want to squeeze this in? All that kind of stuff. Yes, no, I'm not sure. Be honest with these choices, because I personally will be following up. So I want you to be aware. It will be me.
Oh, Amanda, now you're selling. Like, people are going to be like, nope, I don't want to talk. You're going to be like, nope. Hey, Alpa, while people are figuring out yes, no, maybe, I'm not sure whether they want to talk to Amanda or not. Can you put a bow on this for us?
Yeah. Look, we're going to have more and more data. Please protect your data, identify your data assets, and make sure you have the right governance on it. Leverage the technology, but at the same time, understand the risk within those technologies, because nothing is, as I called, there's no rainbows, there's no unicorns. So if you leverage technology, but make sure you have the right people looking and assessing the risk. And make sure you have a right operational resiliency, because none of this cyber attacks are going away by any time soon. Reputational risk is extremely critical and more important. So invest in it. In the 10 years that I've seen, organizations have been successful as they've funded, had the right talent and the right technology. They've kind of sort of passed through this COVID much more better than the others.
Thank you. And I would just add here, I think you're 100% right. And folks, as you're doing this, go for smaller wins. Right. Again, don't, you're not going to start a program from scratch and assess 1,000 vendors. It's a pipe dream. Like people like, I'm going to do 250. No, you're not. Like, right. You're going to get a program stood up. Right. You're going to get something implemented. And you're going to figure out how to assess effectively your first year, or % of your vendors, right? And then you can stand it up. That's a win. You can start assessing. That's a win. You can get good data back. That's a win, and start making decisions, and then grow it over time. The jumping in, 2 feet into the pool is not a good idea. Like right, you eat an elephant one bite.
It's not sustainable, Mike. It's just not sustainable, and it's like you're boiling an ocean, right? And you're not going to get anywhere, to be honest. So. I agree. I think it's small wins, and be strategic, right? Start with the small pool of vendors that are going to be critical to your services, and then expand based on region, the risk, everything else. But yeah, I completely agree with you there.
Yep.
I have one more question, Yafi, if you wanted to read it out or me read it out, but I think you can close it all and end this.
Yeah, legal teams need to understand how evolving third-party risk may impact their contracting and possible litigation process. Think of having information in a centralized location so it can be easily reviewed, allowing teams to identify areas and cost savings to consolidating process with your vendors while also reducing risk. All of these pieces should be communicated to help vendor management teams earn a seat at the table, I guess. So it feels like more of a statement, Christopher, than a question, but I don't disagree with anything that you said.
There's a question mark at the end. That's what threw me off.
Yeah, but just putting a question mark does not make it a question necessarily. It doesn't. That's what my wife tells me anyways. I'm like, so, hey guys, look, I'll wrap it up here and call it. So everybody, Alpa, this was awesome. Thank you. I think we got through a ton. There was a lot of really good information. We will definitely love to have you back and do one of these as a drill down topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one more thing, I did put my email in the chat for everyone. If anyone had any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly. So it's in there. It's afarina@prevalent.net. Other than that, thank you everyone for your time. We'll see you at the next one, and you'll get this recording in a couple of hours from now. Okay.
Wow.
Bye.
Thank you.